Hello, 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 and welcome to part 2 of our top 10 2023 films, where we'll be discussing the top 5 films. For this special episode, we invited our friends Öykü Sofuoğlu and Lawrence Garcia to join us in discussing our top films. Öykü is a critic and PhD student based in Paris, whose writing has appeared in magazines such as the Turkish Altyazı Movie Notebook and the French feminist publication Sobre, todo. This is the first time on the podcast for Lawrence, who is also a PhD student in Toronto and a film critic, whose writing regularly appears in magazines such as Reverse Shot, Movie Notebook, CinemaScope, and In Review Online. The format will be as follows. Each of us will discuss our top 10 favorite films of the year in reverse order, starting with the number 10 top film. If we discuss a film that appears higher on the list of another person, we will skip it and return to it at a later point. Thank you for joining us.
Who's next?
Mine is Human Search, so we skip it because it's Patrick's number 3. 4.
Don't spoil this. Okay, so it's Eliana.
Mine is May December, but then we skip it.
Okay, we skip that as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Yes.
we're back to me, I think.
Yes.
So I have number 5 here, the Devos. Is that higher on
go
anyone
ahead.
else's? Yeah, I think we all saw this at the Berlinale, and this is the first of his films that I've seen, and it's just one of the more texturally pleasurable movies of the year, I think. There is a kind of sort of romantic subplot, but really the movie, it's not really that people-centered. Like, I loved how it integrates this textures of the city with like the images of like her, like the microscopic images that she studies moss, like the female main character, and you have
She's a bryologist.
Yeah, she's a bryologist. I don't want to use that word, but she's a bryologist, and he's like a construction worker, and so you have a kind of, I don't know, it reminded me almost of like a kind of city symphony where you just get a lot of these textures from the city, from just these people interacting. And like the joke at the end is like they meet, but she doesn't even know his name, or she doesn't even remember his name. And that seems to be very much to the point of the movie, is that you kind of, it's almost this world before names, I guess, like where everything, you just sort of note them for their like textural value. That's what I got from the movie.
Yeah, and that was also an aspect I wrote on in my review back then. And I also, you said it's not so much about people. I think it's true, but I also think these very understated little moments between people seem to be sort of thematically related to even this like moss, this sort of structure, this sort of thing that keeps people together, this social fabric in a sense. And I love, for instance, this little talk he has with his sister when it is about him going back to Romania or not, because that's also a film that is about sort of migrant culture, but it never makes it, so much the theme of this. And they are all sort of, at first the film is zooming in on the work there as well, on the construction work, and then it sort of develops into this study of perhaps character constellations. I love this little but very poignant and sweet symbolism of the soup that he's cooking. I think he's cooking 2 soups and then shares the soup with different people. And the camera here is interesting because it's sometimes, when people have already gone, it lingers a bit. And in lingering, it sort of, emphasizes the evanescence of the moment. And you still feel their presence, the people's presence there, but they are gone. And also how the sort of network of people works. And there's this thing that's very endearing and it's very sweet, but it's also funny when the protagonist, when he's told about the Brussels main station being one of the eldest in Europe or something. And then later we hear him pass this message on to his lady as if it was his, and so these narrations that traverse different tongues. I find that I find that beautiful. And there's also this magic element to it. There's this one moment when he steps into a bush and then comes back and holds into the camera something that we don't know what that is, but it feels very magical. And I love that film, and that could easily be higher on my list as well.
I when I think about this movie, a painting comes into my mind, and like in a painting, as if you can look at it closely and you can see the layers and change of colors, that like one color changing into another. And I think here is that kind of movie. Like every scene there's such a subtle and fluid change in movement between scenes or people, that like the texture you just mentioned, I felt especially when the first part of the first sequences in the movies mostly focused on the cityscape, this construction area, buildings, and little by little we kind of move into the more natural landscapes, but it just happens it just happens really sneakily, so you just don't realize it's happening, but it's there. And also about these human connections, I really love Ghost Tropic. I discovered Bastille was thanks to that film, and it's about a lady who falls asleep in the metro, and she just misses her stop, so she has to get back to the city past midnight. So she has this chance encounters with in different parts of this area, like I don't know, the security night security lady, and like a night shop owner, but it's just so random, but random in a way that it kind of reflects our daily encounters with people, and that it's so encrusted in this city life that we sometimes forget. I really love that aspect in here as well. I think that this really random and not really quite superficial human encounters, that being superficial channels deeper meanings to us. Like, I don't know, a simple thing as a soup. Yeah.
This is I'm very happy you mentioned the soup, and but yes, perhaps. Oh, and there's one thing that I did very much like very early on, and I wonder if it was also perceived by everyone else. Just this slight, very simple overlay of the image when we're looking at the trees at some point. I believe it's when the female lead is talking about this feeling, but there's an overlay.
Is it like a dream that she has?
Yes, perhaps it's the dream too.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah, I
is
love
so
the, like,
simple, but it was so beautiful. Sorry, Lawrence.
and then it segues into the kind of like, I don't know, it's like it's sort of the trees and it's like shifting focus with the greenery. Is that kind of the
Yes,
sequence? Yeah.
yeah,
The other moment I think about is like the lights coming on, the automatic lights coming on. It's like in the rain, it's raining, and the lights, the night, what do you call those? The night lamps, street
Lanterns?
lamps coming on, lanterns, coming on automatically. Lots of moments like that sort of spring to mind. Yeah, so that was my number 5. So
Yeah,
Patrick.
my number 5
Patrick.
is, I think that is to be skipped if I see it correctly. That is Nuri Bilge Ceylan's About Dry Grasses.
okay, so Öykü number 4.
I haven't seen this in lots of people lists either. It's Afire by Petzold. I know that lots of people think this is less successful Petzold film, which is maybe I liked it more because I kind of find it a bit too much, this melodramatic aspect, especially in the latest Undine Transit, was maybe because of this chemistry between Paula Beer and Franz Rogowski was too much, that everyone was talking about that. So I kind of pushed me out of the feelings from the film. But Afire was like a, I don't know, like a summer breeze for me. And I talked to Petzold, I wrote about it. So there's lots of things going on in my mind. But I think being a real annoying jerk, and the movie, the way the film never stops itself from criticizing or mocking him, like in a really self-deprecating way. I love that approach a lot, because I think it's kind of a Romerian tale. Like, it's just basically referencing La Collectionneuse, but the Romerian protagonist is not there. It's a completely different and more cynical and humoristic take to Romerian relations. And I also love the scheme that Chris Petzold draws there, with this 3 layers that I myself maybe invented while interpreting the movie, of this mind, body, and world, where this guy who's so obsessed with himself and so feeling having this trust and confidence problems is so stuck in his mind that he denies his body, and he also is hostile against people who is comfortable with their bodies and expressing themselves with their bodies. And he's also in his completely in his mind that he ignores what is happening in the outside, which is forest fire. And even though it's such a simple story between 4 or 5 people about taking place in a summer house, I love this kind of drama that comes from a man and his obsessions, and how it can be linked into so many different layers of human relations, sexuality, environmental disaster. And it's not really, I don't know, it's not really pushed and forced. It just happens so naturally, and I like it. No Petzold fans here.
I'm curious, you said that you compared it to La Collectionneuse, but without the male protagonist. But in some sense, I feel like the male protagonists in La Collectionneuse are some of the most ridiculous male characters in his like entire filmography. Like the men there are so like possessive and self-absorbed, and so in that way they are kind of like this character, I thought.
Yeah, but like, do you think Romer really brings a kind of a layer of criticism or like an outside stance to these characters? I don't think so. Like, it's not really as open as Petzold is.
Yeah, I think Petzold is definitely more upfront with his I think Romer does, but I think the way he does it is quite different. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't personally care for Afire that much, but I also run very hot and cold on Petzold.
I was taken in by it when I first saw it, but we can move on.
Yeah, we can move on. There are lots of big titles ahead.
Yeah, it's true. Perhaps just neither did I care for this film, but I liked the poem that is recited twice. There was a beautiful scene, I thought. Like just
It's
doing
Heine,
it again. Yeah,
right?
again. Yeah, it was Heine. Yeah, that I liked a lot. But I didn't like the overall narrative at the end. That just felt more than the film was actually able to chew. That's Eliana, no?
Yes. So then we're at Our Body. So
Yes.
it's time to talk about Our Body, or not yet?
I think it's time, no? Yep.
Number 5.
Sure.
So this film
Binds us together. This film binds us together. Sorry.
Claire Simon. This film by Claire Simon was also because you were just talking, Lawrence, about how bodies are depicted, but in Joanna Arnaud's film, this is a very different, I suppose, way in that appealed to me just for the very simplicity of it, taking a camera into a hospital and following the day-to-day check-ins, the check-ins that patients who go there have to both either endure or just go through as a checkup was, and as a tract, everything from what is seen as, I mean, the film is called Our Body, but there is a focus on the female body or the body in transition and through all the stages of illness and life and death, female specific or female body specific, endometriosis, pregnancy, ovarian cancer, breast cancer, and other illnesses. And
Men in labor.
yes, labor,
Is it a
miscarriage.
gynecological ward, or I forget.
Yeah.
It's a specific ward, right? Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's the ward that does everything under the umbrella that falls under female, which is even expanded to people who are transitioning either male to female,
Right.
female to
Yeah.
male. And it was very sensitively done. And we have a bit of a twist that I think perhaps
I think we should mention it. Like, it's, don't you think? Like, it's,
Oh, that Claire Simone
yeah.
becomes, yeah, I think.
But I
think
mean,
it's,
that's in the title, no? Like, she
No.
includes herself, notre corps.
yeah,
Not
like,
necessarily, but you
her
don't necessarily
being,
expect that. Yeah. Her being an actual like patient who goes through.
yeah, serious
it-
illness.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other notable aspect, I mean, aside from that, is that the movie is 3 hours long. You don't necessarily expect a film like this, I think, but I think it
Mhm.
really benefits from that and having the range of procedures that it shows, the range of interactions. I mean, Eliana, you mentioned that it's like a very sensitive movie, and I think that's true. And I think that in each scene, you get the sense that the people who are being depicted in the way that they are comfortable with being depicted. And I think that's not always common, especially in like the medical context where, you know, I don't know, you can talk about Foucault and the medical gaze or whatever, but I mean, it's very rare to see a film that really takes the time to sort of portray the people in the way that you feel like they're comfortable with being portrayed, especially in this kind of a setting.
I think what you said is so true, because when I talked to her and upon reading the interviews she gave, she was kind of annoyed by being compared to Wiseman a lot, because she insistently underlined that her ambition, her what she was trying to do was not about depicting hospital system or like this hospital structure, but the interactions between women, and including herself as a woman. So I think what she was trying to do is to not to capture the hierarchies between patients, doctors, or doctors or nurses, but really humanistically human level interactions between these people sharing the same space. But at the same time, this really good intention, the way of thinking, I think cause some criticism or objections, and I think it's normal. I don't remember liking a documentary that didn't cause any criticism, and it's good that we have that. But maybe you know that one of the doctors are actually accused of harassment in France, and there was actually a process going on.
But you know, that's part of the film as well, right? We have the protests on the street that she also captures.
Yes, but it's not like, so you can't please everyone. What I was trying to say, that like you can't please everyone with the depiction in a movie that covers so many subjects and hierarchies and different occupations, people from different backgrounds. Like I remember reading there's transgender issue was also mentioned in criticism. But I think it's having these kind of, I don't want to say failures or negative aspects, but just like personal choices from the filmmaker is really precious, even they're criticized. So maybe people can criticize Simone as being a really naive feminist and assuming a singular body in a plural form, like a woman, woman. I mean, notre corps, it's still singular, right? Our body, not our bodies, but body. There's like a unifying aspect to that. One can interpret this as being a bit naive, but I think I'm happy with this, and I also really respect and find it really empowering the way she depicts herself and bears naked in front of the camera and making herself vulnerable and not assuming the distanced, cold documentary gaze. I think it's really bold, and that's one of the aspects I like the most in the film. This kind of artistic will to be vulnerable as a director, but as a human being.
Yeah, I would agree with just the respect in which she unifies our corporal limitations on this earth. I mean, and shows people who live with illness, shows people for whom the hospital is the home, and but then pushes it into, well, turns the camera on herself, but then also in this depiction of the protest also pushes into this realm of the female body is a very political issue, and something that's been debated, well, in many countries, even the ones that are so-called first world countries. And so questioning the idea of control of the body and making it very relevant, while also pointing out, because I think there has been a bit of a tendency, and especially it seems for French language films recently, you have just to be featuring hospital settings. You have in the acid section of Cannes On the Edge, which was more following a person who's an emergency psychologist, as he goes through all the wards in an underfunded hospital. I mean, the hospital that Claire Simon shows is a public hospital. Then you have De Humani Corpore.
There's also Alice Diop's film On Call. I don't remember the French title, but it's also
Permanence.
Yes.
And
and then there are features as well. So there was Sage Femme that also played at the Berlinale, and there was the La Friction or La Fission.
La Fracture.
La
Fracture.
Yeah.
There's also Médecin de la Nuit or Médecin de Garde, I think, with Vincent McCain. He's portraying a ambulant doctor who gives medication to the addicted people. I don't remember the name, but Médecin de la Nuit or something like that. Anyway,
I'm curious to see how I think often in our lives these are conversations that we don't have necessarily with those who are close to us all the time. It depends. It really all depends, but this pushing of it to the foreground in cinema, and showing hopefully encounters that, if we are fortunate enough not to have, but might also be inevitable too, that you will know someone who experiences such a thing.
Yeah, and just as a last point, maybe from my side, to sort of stress what Öykü said about this non-hierarchy that is depicted here. Also, she uses really inconspicuous cuts there. So you're often, you're just from one scene to the other without, introduction or anything. And I like that a lot because that sort of stresses this point. Yeah. Shall we go on with Lawrence?
So my next one is this Closeness, the Kit Zauhar movie that Patrick had mentioned. This is a film that premiered at South by Southwest, sort of American independent director. Didn't really go that many places, but I think it's a really, really strong film. She has one previous feature called Actual People, which she also starred and directed in. But this one is kind of like a chamber piece almost. You don't realize it at first, but it's entirely set in this one apartment where this couple goes to visit for like the weekend. They're just staying at an Airbnb, and there's like the host hosting them, and there's sort of these tensions that arise between them. But I think what's like most striking about the film is how it sort of incorporates this sort of, it has one of the characters like has an ASMR channel. So they make ASMR videos, and what's interesting is like, well, at some point you do hear an ASMR video, and at some point you see them film an ASMR video. But I think what's most interesting about the film is how it uses these very heightened sensory elements to sort of inflect your perspective on this drama that is going on between these three people in the apartment. And so, yeah, like that sort of, it will move into these very heightened like sounds and sensory elements that sort of transform your sense of how these people are interacting, and will shift your perspectives on them in really, really interesting ways. Yeah, I don't know, Patrick, maybe you, since you've seen it as well.
Yeah, and Eliana even saw her previous film as well. Just for this, what you just mentioned, the ASMR part, I love the scene when she's just performing it to this roommate there. So the guy who lives there, because usually this is a sort of parasocial form of communication, right? But there you see it play out in real life, and you see how awkward that suddenly can become, and the film captures this so well. So there is this heightened intimacy, but at the same time, you also, as a spectator of this, you see the if not the falsity, then at least the, I don't know, you see more, or like you see the thing performed. You don't just hear it, you don't just have it in your ears. And it felt so vulnerable, the way this guy is enjoying this, just, and we looking at him. And I think I haven't seen something quite as vulnerable as this perhaps in this year. So yeah, it was fascinating.
And the first half for me, I mean, when you were talking earlier about horror films, I was just like, oh, I was completely tense throughout this interaction.
Just like the interactions, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, this was a horror film.
Yeah, the writing is so good. I think, it's easy to overlook how good the writing actually is, because it makes you cringe permanently, but on a very high level. And I mean, it doesn't.
I think.
Yeah, sorry.
I was gonna say my favorite line in the film is when the boyfriend of the actress, who's also the director, tells her that she doesn't really look that Asian. Because, I mean, I think I've read an interview of hers where she says, I am Asian, or like she's half Asian, I think. But she doesn't really look that Asian, so she doesn't get cast for Asian roles. And so she's like, well, if I want to act, I just have to kind of direct my own movies and cast myself. So this was like a very funny kind of element. Like, I didn't realize that watching this film, but I only realized it after. But that line sort of stuck out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, your number 4, Patrick?
Oh yeah, but did you want to add anything else? Sorry.
No,
no,
just
fine.
so that the director's work is a rabbit hole that I like to explore, and very looking forward to, because actual people there's more about this Asian identity in that as well.
Yeah, but I think we will skip mine again, because that's Radu, Jude. Do not expect too much from the end of the world.
Okay.
So
Number 3?
Los Delincuentes. So I think it was in your list.
Yes.
This is really hard to define genre movie, I think. Do you want to start maybe?
Someone has described it as a slow cinema heist film, but I don't think it's necessarily slow cinema. It might have David Ehrlich, or I would say it's a very comical yet simply presented plot, where in Argentina there's a man who also has a different name, that this name is an anagram of all the
Many names
of many names and many characters that present, and it just is a sort of bifurcation in some sense, for me at least, of what it means to desire something else, perhaps a simpler pastoral life away from the city, and how this takes its role on the two main characters who take turn sharing screen time and ultimately figure out a different journey on the way. But
I think while I was watching the movie, like we watch a lot of movies, right? So every time we see something, as we were mentioning in a movie, we kind of associate events happening to an eventual narrative. Like, you can guess what will happen next if you're like an adept cinephile. But with this movie, it was so surprising and invigorating in terms of narrative, while being so simple, like just heist movie. There's a money hidden, there's a guy who's in prison, but every time when something happened, it was completely unexpected. At least it was for me. And I also really loved this humor, really nonsensical humor between names that really don't serve anything whatsoever in the movie. And I think, like, when I think about the things I like, they don't make any coherent whole, but these just really small details that just stands out, and it's so craftfully made it's a 3 hour, like more than 2.5 hour, I think. And for such a simple plot, I think it's really successful to like keeping us our curiosity alive. And I mean, I think what my appreciation mostly comes from this formal and narrative side of storytelling. Yeah. And that's why maybe I kind of likened it to a Raul Ruiz movie. I can't remember the title, but this like intricate storytelling reminded me of Ruiz.
Yeah, I think the playfulness of the narrative has aspects of Ruiz. The tone is kind of different, but I can see the sort of just the interest in stories and stories upon stories. Like yeah. I mean, I didn't think of Ruiz. I thought more of like Argentine directors, like the Trenke, Lauken sort of.
New Argentinian cinema.
Yeah, like the sort of the La Flor kind of group. Yeah.
And I don't know if it's giving it away, but one little detail I like is that the boss of the man who tries to escape his bank job is played by the same actor who becomes his prison boss, which I think is funny once you see the film.
Yeah, totally.
But yes, we can move on to
your number 3, I think.
Okay, my number 3.
4.
Number 4.
It's
Un Prince.
I think it's in Lawrence's list as well.
That's my number 3. So we can.
Would you like to start?
Well, we can just talk about it because that's what I was going to talk about next. Yeah, A Prince by Pierre Creton. This is the first of his films that I've seen. The other ones that are available online don't have subtitles, and me being a non-French speaker, unfortunately, I can't watch them. But I was really taken with this. It's sort of nominally about a young person who goes and studies like to be a gardener. So he goes to this training center, and he grows up at some point, and he has like these like queer relationships with like the various men around there. But there's also this sort of subplot with like an adopted son of one of the people who runs the center. In any case, I think the movie I find what's most interesting is how it sort of incorporates like these kind of documentary textures with this very like almost outlandish and erotic narrative. And the way it sort of integrates like image and sound, it reminded me a bit of like Duras, like Marguerite Duras's movies, where there's always like the image and sound is always out of sync, but there's always a kind of, but it's the way it uses like your expectation of the images to integrate with like this sort of narrative that you can't quite piece together, that I find really pleasurable about this film. I don't know. There's also one moment which I don't know if I will go into, but maybe you can, Eliana, mention. There's like a very striking image, shall we say, in the film that if you have seen the film, you will not forget.
I found that this film was also a very strange sort of viewing experience because it started to hit things that of pleasure in my brain, but I can't entirely, upon first watching it and then seeing it again, vocalize, but something about the sexuality, the bodies, the display of older bodies entangled with a younger body, this very simple little effects. One is a dissolving effect, and then the other is at some point this this mythical creature emerges from someone's pants. 7 heads? 8 heads? Shall we even be more direct about it?
No, I think that's fine.
And this subplot of the adopted son, which also turns into almost a fairy tale. I think we have at some point someone on a boat reading or writing a letter or reading an entry. And I liked this one scene in particular where he's in bed, the man is in bed, and then he gets out of bed. And previously he was in bed with 2 other older men, and then someone comes back to the bed, and all of them are older. And this is just so simple, but I think it appealed in understanding the passage of time and the eternal aspect of sexuality and how this should, in some sense, persist, hopefully.
Would you perhaps remind me, and also just for listeners, I think, isn't there something like a collective around this director? Like, aren't there several filmmakers or like artists or something that collaborate there? Or is that too much to ask now? I just know there was something that was interesting, but
yes, but I don't think I can speak accurately on it. But do you?
Yeah, I can't really speak to that either.
Okay, that's fine.
But it is, as I've heard, the film that is most personal to Pierre Creton, and has to do a lot with his personal encounters with people who had taken him in when he was much younger, and was entering the film world and the gardening milieu. And Prince, I don't know where people will be able to see it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's bad.
For this,
I don't think anywhere.
it was a very
I fear.
It was a very quiet film. And
I think it released in France, no? Or
sure,
maybe.
I don't know. I don't know.
It does have distribution in the US already.
Oh wow!
So it will come out next year. Strand releasing. They usually do a lot of queer cinema. So like last year they picked up the Alain Giraudy movie, and they picked this up as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's surprising to me. Okay.
That was number 3. So Patrick.
Yeah, mine is The Human Search 3. I don't know if someone still has that, or
Yeah, it's mine.
so now we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what a film. What a film. That's also part of the greater narrative about Argentinian film at the moment, I suppose, even though with that film, it's really a global event, right? With all these different characters seemingly without any friction traverse from one country to the next, from one image to the next. And yeah, it's fascinating. I heard this is very much inspired by Michael Snow's La Région Centrale. I haven't seen that film, but I heard, so for anyone who's from Berlin, this will play at the Arsenal in January. So I'm looking forward to seeing that in January. And yeah, like La Bête, what I really liked is also this sort of glitchy, this glitchy poetics that that is basically dominating the entire imagery while still like meandering around and traversing not only in time and space, but also in language as well. And there is seemingly no barrier between people and experiences with Argentina, Portugal, the Netherlands, Taiwan, Brazil, Hong Kong, Sri Lanka, Peru. So we have so many countries, and I think there's so many images I've never seen like that. He uses this sort of spherical camera with like 360 degrees, 8 lenses I read, 11K. So it's really something I've never seen like that before. And I like the first part, and I like the third part now, perhaps even more. There's not too much I can actually contribute like thesis wise or something, because I couldn't find my notes on this either. But I still, like, if I just think of this film, these images are still in my mind, and I would really die to see that film in cinema, but I don't know if I will have the chance.
I can help you on the thesis part. Maybe I'm a bit exaggerating my theory, or it's too preposterous. I don't know, but you know this Tom Gunning article about early cinema and how our vision is formed by the other movements in daily lives, like trains, panorama, dioramas, before the cinema, and how it shaped our vision in the end of the century. So when I see the current audiovisual environment that we're living in, this movie, it kind of like an aspect of this change in our vision and habits of viewing the world and the people because this spherical camera is kind of like the way of, I don't know, approaching this change, right? Because, I mean, our attention span is really changed, the way we look at the images. When you think about the transitions between people and spaces and places, it kind of reminds me of this internet habits of looking at the videos and different people, like, I don't know, if you're in Instagram or TikTok and you just like swap it and you're in a different country, in a hearing different language. So this was my idea of, I think, approaching this film, was how it is related to our own understanding and approach to this new cinema, new visual intuitions
Regime.
and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. But that's why it's surprising to me to hear that La Région Centrale was the inspiration. Because I thought the Michael Snow film that I thought about while watching this film was Corpus Callosum. I don't know if you've seen that one, but it's one that has a lot of, it's like footage of an office space, but like super digitally manipulated. So like the image like twists and turns, like things enlarge. Like it's just, I think it's characteristic of our new sort of visual regime that like what we consider like normal like movement or normal how things are supposed to look is a very like malleable and plastic in a way that's like definitely different from before. It's like we expect that every image can be like manipulated in such a way that like what we perceive as like normal movement is very different than, 100 years ago, for instance. That's sort of what I find interesting about this film.
And you wrote actually a really nice review on it in reverse shot, which for me illuminated the process of how you choose the images in the post production in this directorial. Please.
Yeah, so he shot it with a 360-degree like camera, and so what it allowed him to do was to sort of frame things in post-production. So he had, the 360-degree footage, but using a kind of VR sort of workflow, he can like trace a path through that footage. So theoretically, like everything we're seeing, he's like, you can like do that. He could capture different images from like the images that we're seeing. And theoretically, he can do that with the entire movie and generate, I don't know, like 1 billion different movies, potentially.
Yeah, I think I also read at some point he, like rather early on in the shoot, he said that he wouldn't even care too much whether some things wouldn't quite work or something, if some ideas he had planned out wouldn't quite work out that way, because then this process would have been even crazier than it already was. So he just went for the imperfection there as well.
We should move on.
Okay.
My number 2 is May December.
We can talk about it. It's my number 2 as well.
I mean, it's of course one of the movies that it's talk about the most these days, especially after the Todd Haynes comment on camp. I don't know if our listeners have followed this, but I think the keywords that used the most when talking about the movie was melodrama, camp, and soap opera, I guess. I don't want to go into details of the plot, but I really thought, well, that everything was so unclear, ambiguous, to have a clear understanding of what this movie is actually trying to do. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, of course. On the contrary, it opens so many discussions about what we call camp and how these concepts are easily used as like an interchanging way. But actually, it kind of invited us to think about what these concepts and genres really mean.
I think what I find most appealing about the film is like whether you call it camp, melodrama, it's like what's interesting is that there is this sort of event at the core of this this film, which is like, okay, when how many years ago, like this 36-year-old woman seduced this 10-year-old boy or something. And now you have this distance from the event. And what's interesting is you have all of these like different performance registers integrated into the same movie. You have like this really, I don't know, you could really call it like sort of campy aspects with, the crash zoom into Julianne Moore, saying
The
like,
music.
yeah, with the music coming in. But you also have these other scenes where, Natalie Portman is just sitting with the ex-husband and they're just having a normal conversation. And it's a entirely different performative register, but it's still related to the same event. And then you have another scene where Natalie Portman is talking to the lawyer and they're having another conversation. And it's just kind of like, I don't know, it's almost like a journalist interviewing like a subject. And then at some point, the former son or like the son from the previous marriage, Georgie, comes out of the background because he's been singing in the background and he comes into the frame and enters the frame and suddenly the sort of performance register shifts again. And I think it's this sort of the way the film like keeps integrating these different like performance registers in relation to the same event that I find very interesting about it.
And it has so many complex characters. Like each of them were so rich and so full of interesting aspects. Like I don't remember any movie that I watched recently that had so many colorful characters inside. Like each of them really interestingly crafted, really distinguished aspects, like standing out. And since the movie was released on Netflix, like it's talked over and over on Twitter, and lots of people like pointed out so many details, like the dress detail, for example. I haven't really realized that the Julianne Moore's Gracie wears actually her daughter tries, and she says like, "Oh, you're so brave that you want to wear this because your arms are so, chubby." And then she wears herself. Like this is so clever and so subtle. I really love these kind of details. And also I think every performance really stands out. Like Natalie Portman, I don't think she's a really good actress in many movies, but I think Todd Haynes has this capacity of knowing how to channel the potential in every actor that he's working with.
Strangely, at number 3.
Okay.
Well,
So this is a film that Sobre, todo, noche. So it was at Venice in Giornate degli Autori, which is the equivalent of Director's Fortnight at Cannes, kind of, and by Victor Iriarte. And it appealed to me. It's the film that might have touched me the most simply for the content, but also the way that it's told was quite fascinating. It is a film where one person becomes 3 people at some point in this mother-son relationship. One hand becomes 3 hands. There are different gestures. There are different ways of expressing oneself through these movements that are often overlooked. There's an immense focus on what hands do and how and the characters are brought to life with how they use their hands. There's an underlying theme of piano players versus stenographers, and the way that this film is structured is in chapters that come from an epistolary sense. So a letter is written to one person, and then one person writes a letter to another person. And then it plays with genre in terms of melodrama and thriller, while also remaining, in some sense, at its core, a film that tries to confront historical wrongdoings through a very personal lens of the family structure and how this comes together in the end. And I think for me, it was very powerful, and it was delivered in very, would you say, understated way. Patrick got to see it.
yeah, pretty much so. But I like that even the violence is sort of codified here. So the violence is, for instance, in the stenography, because it's about these separation from, of mothers from their babies, like quite a few thousands over a few decades in Spain. So it's a bit like this unearthing that Almodovar did a few years ago with Madres Paralelas. And here, the stenography, to me, it also pointed at this sort of obedience to the higher order in Spain as well. And there's this one person, you listen to the one professor, and that's how you learn. So they, to me, also got this, there was this sort of element of violence without displaying any violence. I think, and what you said about the threefoldness of character, maybe that also applies to the genre, right? As you said, it's all at once at the same time, and really very confident. It's very confident filmmaking because it doesn't introduce any of the modes and means it employs. It just throws you in, and you have to work with it. So, yeah.
And then
is that now your number two, Eliana? Because that was your number
that's
three,
my
no?
number three, strangely.
Yeah.
Perhaps there was just a lot of overlap with other films.
You should go to your number two then.
All right, so then my number two would be A Wild Rumor, which I believe, did Patrick briefly mention?
Yeah, that was in my mentions earlier.
A Korean film by Jeong-Hong.
That is technically also a 2022 release.
Ah, yes, thank you for calling me out on that. And this is a film that depicts almost a snapshot of reality in a way that plays with fate without ever invoking fate. It plays with the movement of characters. Once again, I think this is a theme that I like. One becomes three and then kind of four people. And it's material necessity that draws people from different class backgrounds in Korea to some form of new cohabitation, which is of interest to me because I think there's a theme in cinema these days to sort of embrace this, I don't want to say communal, but something that is larger than just two people or a family sharing space, but rather strangers who might occupy one space, and how it is that how people can be drawn together. But the film unravels essentially without one knowing where it might go as well. An incident occurs, and the main character, who's kind of an unlikable yet somewhat relatable carpenter, faces damage to his car, and he tries to find out who did it. And in that process, we see how he goes about trying to peacock and assert his status without by also failing to necessarily be. He's incidentally sharing a space with a couple that has a very luxurious home that's made so that it could be separate but together. And those are the overarching themes that
and I think the film has one of the greatest dialogues I've seen this year as well. There's this great dialogue, how there's this sort of working class bonding, and then in a dialogue about the World Cup in 2002, the football, the World Cup, the soccer ensues, and it's really totally unhinged. There are connections to be drawn, how this event sort of was the worst for Korean society, and it just, the way this worker who tries to put things together that don't belong together is so fascinating. And it's sort of, it invites you into a way of thinking that is so counterintuitive, but therefore it feels all the more real. So I like that film quite a lot.
There's something a bit as if when one watches this film, one can think, nothing happened in this film. But I think that's also Very, very brilliant. The silent brilliance of it.
Yeah, I think one of the things in cinema I like most is when things that seemingly have no bearing on anything, they become sort of the obsession of people. And in this film, just a car gets jumped on by someone, and the protagonist tries to find out what happened with this car at night. And that's it. And this takes up such a large chunk of the film, and it seems so like, what is even the point? But to him, it's so important. And then his obsession becomes so entertaining to see. So yeah, I like that quite a lot. Is that you now, Lawrence, or was your number 2 also May, December?
My number 2 is also May-December, so I think it's you now.
Okay, so for me, it's now Inside the Yellow Cocoon Shell by Pham Thien An. This film blew me away, really, at Cannes. I think it was, yeah, among the most stellar filmmaking I've seen in years. I think every scene seems so controlled, seems to incorporate many ideas at the same time. It's also this very first scene of the film that is basically his short film that won in the Cannes in 2019, now has sort of evolved into his feature debut. So this is from a Vietnamese director. So also cinema that we don't see very often, at least I don't. And yeah, this, I know it's heavily charged in like Christian iconography and Christian like spiritual thinking, but I couldn't care less about that. I still think the filmmaking itself is so exceptional. I was really at awe. It's, in many scenes, because there always seems to be an underlying concept. There is this great scene, for instance, that seems so inconspicuous almost. It's when the protagonist, so he becomes inadvertently the guardian of his nephew because the son of his brother dies, but we never see the brother. We rather know that this protagonist was close to his sister-in-law, so the wife of his brother. And so he now has to take care of this young boy. But he now goes to this town to find his brother. And there he encounters this man, Mr. Liu. And the way we approach this Mr. Liu is through a window that is open. And it's as slowly as possible, almost, the camera zooms in on this Mr. Liu, but we don't see him at all. But we already hear the talking of the two of them. And I feel like this is such a clever way to make us curious in seeing Mr. Liu, which would otherwise, or who would otherwise perhaps be a character that is not too much of interest to us. He's this old, like he's this guy who says, I miss it to be in combat, because there was at some point, there was his sort of, there was a thing that perhaps when he felt most alive, and now he's lacking that, and he leads this persistence in this rural town, or even less than a town, rural, village perhaps. And through this zooming, there is a sort of anticipation to seeing him. And very often in this film, it's so heavily charged with meaning, and that the greatness of it is that Pham Thien An is conscious of it. So it's constantly interrupted. So whenever you think you might reach a sort of transcendent moment, it's interrupted. There are many scenes like this. There's a massage scene when the phone rings, for instance. There is a funeral where we see someone just doom swiping their phone or doom scrolling on their phone. We see the same sort of funeral festivity. We see that this, in fact, is screened on a computer because our protagonist is editing this ceremony. So we repeat it again and again. And there's so many of these scenes that I think the filmmaker is just very conscious of what he's doing, and yeah, I don't think there are many filmmakers for whose next project I will be as excited as for this one. So that's from Tianan Inside the Yellow Cocoon Shell, which recently also won the Bazar Prize, Cannes. I think in the jury were people such as Albert Serra, so I was happy for that as well. So does that bring us, or is there anything you'd like to add to that film? I don't, like Lawrence, is there anything that is still on your mind about that film?
Not really. I feel like you've got it covered. I like aspects of it. I think I'll definitely be interested to see his next film, but I wasn't quite convinced by this one in the same way that I'm not quite convinced by like Be Gone, for instance, whose films I think it's hard not to think about it with the 6 stream long take kind of thing. Like watching some of these sequences, I thought of Kaylee Blues and some of the reservations that I have about that. But definitely a director whose films I will be looking out for.
Mm-hmm.
I would only
add
a little warning, because the first time I saw this, I really marveled at the magic of the cinematography. And then I saw it again. And this was a very strange experience. It was just like watching a magician's trick that you can see through. And this was horrible. So I don't know if anyone will ever experience this or...
But that is funny because the protagonist is a magician and performs many tricks.
Yes. But we can
move on to, is that number 1 for Öykü?
Yeah, so saluta Bobita. I'll start by saying this. And it's of course one of the funniest movies of the year, probably. But I think Radu, I don't know if you pronounce Jude or Jude.
I thought it's Jude, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't want to.
I say Radu Jude, but I think he's one of the most influential political and filmmakers of our contemporary cinema. I always loved Radu Jude's work, and Bad Luck Banging Looney Porn was also one of my favorites of the year when it's released. But like in this film, there are so many layers about the history of cinema, about cinematic references to Romanian cinema, the world cinema, but also it's about social inequalities, hierarchies, and corruption, and how this kind of exploitation reverberates in different circles and spheres in professional life. But the way Jude approaches it is not at all cynical. Of course, there are some aspects of dark humor there. This kind of black and white imagery kind of reflects this aspect, but I think he at the end finds the human gaze. I don't want to talk about the plot of the movie, but there's Angela. She's like a production assistant for a documentary about working environment security. So she has to find people who had work accidents. And she finds a man who is bound to a wheelchair. And at the end, like this 3-hour-long movie, like the third half of it, I think, is reserved for this man on wheelchair, and we only see him on the screen. And I think it's such a generous and bold way to give space to a person who otherwise won't be shown on a big screen. And like there are so many layers regarding this Angela character, because it's also linked to another film in Romanian cinema that is called Angela Moves On, where we see a woman who becomes a driver that kind of resonates with the Angela we see in Radu's actual movie, because she's also traveling around Bucharest, like trying to meet with people, meetings and everything, trying to working all the time.
Yeah, very precarious.
Yeah, and she also there's so many things to talk about, actually. Like that's why I'm trying to I find it difficult to bring ideas together, because because she also has a a persona, an avatar on TikTok, where she uses this filter of Andrew Tate, like reflected on her face, and called Bobitsa, where she talks in a really crude way. And this is interesting because what I like about Radu Jude cinema is that he opens spaces for people. This character was actually invented by the actress herself as a part of the feminist art project. So as he did with this wheelchair-bound person, he also opened the filmic space to her. And I found this really endearing. And in this really huge cinematic world, there's also a space for Godard, for example, or Uwe Boll. Like this is such a generous and open space for rich ideas. Like there's lots of intellectual and ideological stuff there, but I don't think Jude is being condescending or intellectualizing everything. I think it's rather accessible comparing to, for example, The Barbarians or Bad Luck Banging, because it's more, I think, related to Romanian bureaucracy, this dialogue in the school and the history of Romania. So there's another Angela that actually Radu Jude is referring to by this formal choice that he's employing in the movie, which is slowing down the image. The filmmaker duo Yervan Yenikyan and Angela Ricciolucci's films. So there's so many layers there. And I don't know, like after Godard's death, I feel like Jude kind of represents to me type of filmmaking that is kind of in verge of disappearance. So that's why I really cherish it.
Yeah, and to this idea that the images are slowed down of the other Angela, that is also his idea of sort of using cinema as an archive to reflect on the society back then, because he uses that in order to show us how what we would call real life looked like under then. So
Ceausescu.
Yes, yeah, under his regime, imagery of the everyday life that was not allowed, that was censored back then. So he uses cinema as an archive here to find a sort of historical truth, and I appreciate that very much.
And also, he's not hostile against new technologies. I think he's critical towards them, but he also employs them to criticize them.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I had the chance to see the film again 2 days ago in Berlin. He was there for a Q&A again, and he said also that his next film will be shot on iPhone. And
oh my god. And is it the Dracula film? Because I know that he's working on a Dracula film.
Oh, I don't know, but maybe that was his project, because he was in Berlin for a year or so for the DAAD, and he had an assigned project here for which he got money. He also talked a lot about financing and how he just wants to keep doing these small movies of like a few €100,000 budget, but after the Golden Bear, his producers and other people, they wanted him to, transition to English films and make bigger budget films, also because then the margins might get, higher that the producers would possibly earn. But yeah, he's not that guy, and I love him.
That's why we love him. That's why we love him.
Yeah. Okay. What a good pick. Is there anything you wanted to add, Lawrence, on Radu?
No, except that I do agree that he is like the most Godardian filmmaker working. So yeah. And in just the way that Öykü's talking about. Yeah,
just the way he captures the anarchical, like that must be so difficult, because it seems so random, but nothing there can be random, in film that's not quite possible to depict something as random that is not planned. It's crazy. Okay, I guess that leads us to Eliana. You're number one.
I should be like really ashamed of this choice, like not making in my list.
No, Nuri Bilge Ceylan's About Dry Grasses will be my number one, because it's such a riveting film. I think, that we talked about it previously with Öykü, and it just opens up so many different conversations. I think it's beautifully unfolds this dynamic they have of the characters. I think I just like films. Many of the films that I think are in the top 10 feature men who are somehow perhaps potentially even impotent, or it's highly suggested, this impotency or this some sort of inability to perform, or this lower, earlier, I don't even know if you see Afire character as this as well. And and in terms of action, inaction, the ideas behind bringing civilization to a small space, the frustration that comes with this man who is in his own world to some degree, this competition between his roommate, how he goes about getting the attention of Nuri, a woman who also has a political history behind it that Öykü has talked a little bit to me about.
But also,
not sure if there is
also to get the attention of the student, right?
Yes. And ultimately, this film for me is about the need to desire something that is perhaps greater than what we should be earthly desiring, not in this very vulgar sense, but rather in the sense of how we would like to be perceived. And that ultimately pushes it to my number one, even though I have not said much. But perhaps I'll throw it to you if you wanted to elaborate.
Yeah, I can maybe go on more about Ceylan's, how it stands out in Ceylan's filmography, because I think the opening shot is really significant, because when the film starts, you immediately say, okay, I'm watching a Ceylan film. There's a guy in the back, in far away, walking in the really snowstorm. Okay, this is a Ceylan film. But I think he knows that he's arrived in a moment in his career that he has developed a distinct and significant style that he starts to reference it. He starts to create a meta reflection on it through these self-referential details in the movie. Like there are so many things that we can talk about the film, as you said, but what struck me the most was this formal experiments he does through the use of his own photos that we see in a slideshow aesthetic. When the male protagonist Samet shows the photo he has been taking to, but these photos actually, we see the camera, it's just like a really cheap 2000s digital first, one of the first digital cameras probably, and you understand that this camera can't shoot these pictures, so you immediately understand it's actually these photos are taken by Ceylan himself, and he kind of subtly inserts his own gaze into the movie. And there's another self-referential moment, I think, is when Samet, before having sex with Nuri, goes into a bathroom, and the bathroom door opens to the backstage of the film. That when this happens, I was like, what is happening? You won't expect this to happen in a Ceylan movie. So I think he sort of reminds us that we are actually watching a Ceylan movie, as he did in the beginning. This is a Ceylan movie. And I think the fact that he starts to think about his own choices, own style, is really promising maybe for his next projects. Because I think these kind of auteurs, as we call, when they achieve a sort of level of recognition and a distinctive style, they just start to lose their probable originality or this authentic style. So what I like is that when he's in this really mature period, that he start to think and discover new realms in his cinema. But I don't want to go into details about politics, really.
Well, Patrick, this was your number 5?
It was my number 5, yes. Yeah, many things were already said. I really liked this Lolita aspect in this film, that he sort of charges this young girl with all this meaning, and there is this sort of inversion of this dialogue we hear in Call Me by Your Name, when the father talks to his son about how precious these moments of youth and love are, and that they cannot be brought back, but later they will be even more precious to you, and you'll look back on them. And he basically holds the same speech, but to her, young girl who's not, like, she's not on his discursive level. It's sort of everything he says there, it's really just for himself, and he feels like he wants to listen to himself and hear himself. And I found this really fascinating. And the fact that the film sort of ends on that voiceover as well, that feels so almost stifled, but it's sort of a caricature of that, like a subpar film perhaps would end like this, but this film sort of reflects that as well, that this would sort of be the tradition of that genre, and he plays with that, I think. And that is something I want to point out.
And just the last thing, going off of that, it's so fascinating to me to see how people are reacting to this character of Summit, and how a lot of people are very eager to say this is a horrible person, this is a horrible guy. And but in terms of wanting to listen to his own self, this came up a little bit earlier off the mic, in terms of how this letter that we never know who it's addressed to is interpreted. And Öykü had one version of an interpretation, and I find that's curious that there's a variation within that as well, on how people are just receiving the ambiguity of this scene, and also the scene when he gets offset, and just how this doesn't necessarily mean anything, but just how it is open to different variations of how one might.
But I think that totally does, because it's so much about him performing, because he always leaves the door open. He wants to display that there is no hidden self. What he displays to people, that he wants others to believe that this is him already. So when he goes to this when he goes offset, this sort of brings that idea to life, that there he's preparing for his next performance. But it's a great choice. I love that film as well.
Now we have the number 1 from Lawrence.
So my number 1 is this is a film that I saw in the Berlin Forum. It's called About 30. I don't know that many people have seen it. It's by a young Argentine director, Martin Shanley. I think the Spanish title is Arturo a los 30. And it's sort of like the sort of my pithy, like, kind of how description of this would be like Je t'aime, but shifted to the key of a slacker comedy. And I think so it basically follows this kind of 30-year-old sort of slacker. His life is going nowhere, and he's attending a wedding of a friend of his. And then an accident happens, and then suddenly we're dropped into like previous moments from the past decade of his life. And we sort of skip between this sort of present tense of the accident and the aftermath of the accident when he goes to the wedding, and all of these moments in the past. And so I think what I appreciated most was just like the structure of this film. Well, for one thing, it's a very funny film, but also just like the way that the structure sort of brings like these like past memories in relation to the present event, and kind of transforms how we understand the event, but in a way that is far more unpredictable than you would expect. Like there are some like digressions that just feel completely out of place, but then once you return, they have a certain kind of function that you would not be able to anticipate. But it's just the sort of sense of how it uses the structure to shift our expectations and our like expectations of the narrative. And it just keeps doing it again and again. And I think it's just an extremely smart, well-directed, really, in the end, quite touching comedy. But yeah, I don't know. It's not a film that I think like jumps out necessarily as, oh, this is like the number one film of the year, but it's it's like was there since Berlin, and it has at least stayed there for me in terms of a film that I've quite loved from this year.
And do you see that in relation also to the Arno film?
Yeah, I was just going to ask that.
Yeah, there's definitely like a connection there. I didn't think of it until just now when you asked, but yeah, like I guess I like in general films that play with structure in really interesting ways and sort of use that structure to like not manipulate, but to sort of shift our interest in expectation and narrative and story. And I think both of those films do that really quite well, both in a kind of comic register as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Patrick.
Great. So for me, it's the number one is Zhang Lu's The Shadowless Tower, also a Berlin title, also a film that is probably heavily underseen because I don't think there are many ways to see that film. Yeah, Zhang Lu, I only really discovered him weeks before the Berlinale, and then I watched 3 or 4 films in a row. I really love Gyeongju of him. And Zhang Lu's an interesting filmmaker. He's a bit like Lee Chang-dong in a way, that they both have a Korean background, even though Zhang Lu is technically Chinese, but he's sort of from this Korean Chinese background, even the sort of community there. And he also had another profession earlier. He was a novelist who turned to be a film director, and his filmmaking really just resulted from a bet with his friends that filmmaking is so easy. He could just make a film, and then he made a short film, so submitted it to Venice. There, it was relatively successful as it goes for short films, and then he was just part of the circus basically. And Lee Chang-dong is among his friends. That's also why Burning is referenced in that movie as well, when they are in a cafe or so. And then, yeah, it's adjacent to a theater, so Burning is playing there. That's lovely because I love Burning. It's one of my favorite movies. Yeah, so The Shadowless Tower, it's to me also such a poetic film. It's in so many ways it feels like, yeah, maybe like literature as well, a bit like the Ceylan does. Feels very novelistic, and there are a lot of motifs that are repeatedly explored and sort of readjusted, so they take on different meanings. We follow the sort of food critic, and as so often in Zhang Lu's films, there's a younger woman who you may argue fulfills a sort of functionalistic, a bit like a device, but often challenge the characters, or they challenge them to behave differently. And as so often with his films, this is a very secluded protagonist, very withdrawn. There's this motif in this film that politeness sort of keeps people at bay in this culture. So it's a very polite protagonist, but therefore he also never really takes a chance, never really dares to reach out to people. And that makes all the moments that are centered on the relationships of people all the more endearing and all the more heartfelt. Yeah, often very dreamlike, this film. And yeah, there are just a few scenes that stand out to me. But yeah, it's also about this lost relationship to the father. But the father was also kicked out of the house because, there's this loose accusation that he harassed people, and it's never really properly addressed in the film. And there, a lot of things that are not really explained. It's rather, we are thrown in, and I think the film develops its own style so effortlessly that, for me, it was really a home run. And,
Wow,
Yeah.
we
It's
made
definitely a
it.
film that I will see again at some point because I was very jet lagged during Berlin, and
Oh,
so maybe I wasn't the most alert while seeing this film, but I will give it another shot for sure on your recommendation.
Good to hear. Yeah, and that brings us to an end. Yeah, applause to us. I cannot believe that we made it. But I also wanted to give the two of you a chance to perhaps tell us, like our listeners, where can we find you on the internet? And is there something like a piece of writing you feel like, if proud is too big of a word, but writing you're satisfied with, that you would like people to check out, perhaps?
I guess you can find me on Letterboxd as I don't even know what my account is. L
Will-
Garcia on Letterboxd. You can find me on Twitter. I also have a Substack. It's just lawrencegarcia.substack.com. I don't write on it that often, but on that Substack there is an essay that I wrote on Twin Peaks: The Return, or the third season of Twin Peaks. It's a very long essay. It's like 15,000 words. Don't read it if you haven't seen the show because it won't make any sense. But if you have seen the show, you can read that. That's probably the single piece of writing that I'm most happy with.
Again, this will all be in the show notes.
and you can find me on every social media that you can imagine. I'm everywhere. It's Feride Mercury, like Freddie, but in drag. And I don't know. I honestly don't have any writing that I'm proud of. I'm such a self-deprecative person. But yeah, I feel like I'm more comfortable writing in French. I feel that I can express myself more poetically in French language. So if you read French, you can read my French writings on sorocinet.com. If you read Turkish, there's Altyazı, and there are some few interviews and writings there everywhere. You can find, if you check my Twitter, you probably can find the other writings as well. But I think what I'm proud of the most is the interview we did with Dora, with Radu. It was such a great experience for me. Yeah, I think the interview with Radu, Jude, and do not expect too much from the end of the world could be the best piece that I didn't write. So anyway, yeah, thank you guys for having us here.
No, thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.